welcome to another in the Why Study series. Today we're looking at the question of why study the earliest form of the Eucharist. That's Professor Tom O'Loughlin to enlighten us on this one.
The Eucharist is a central event for most Christians, and in almost every celebration of the Eucharist there is a very conscious and deliberate remembering. And this is a remembering that goes all the way back to "do this in remembrance of me," which is found in the first letter to the Corinthians by St. Paul. So there is this clear thing. What we're doing now is an act which recalls, reenacts, brings us into the presence of this original event. And this original event is seen as the supper of Jesus on the night before he suffered. So on the day before he suffered, he did. But once you actually say that the Eucharist is a remembrance, a reenactment, a memorial of the Last Supper, you suddenly realize that the early Eucharist is not just simply one event, but is actually bristling with problems. So let's just look at the simplest problem. By the time that Paul is writing to the Corinthians, by the time that the Didache is being compiled, we can put both of those in the 50s, and certainly both of these are being used in the churches in the 60s. And by the time that Mark is preaching his gospel, going round from church to church preaching, and that's again in the 60s, the Eucharist is a weekly event. It's not called the Eucharist, but the weekly gathering of the Christians is a gathering for a meal. And the gathering for the meal is where Christians express where they are and who they are. Because at that meal, and we shouldn't think of very large congregations, we should think of gatherings of 20, 30, 40, at the outside 50 people who share a common meal, and in the midst of this common meal offer thanksgiving to the Father using a formula. This is the event that makes them Christians. It's at these events, for instance, that the Gospels would have been preached. But this is a weekly event, yet when you look at the ideal story of the origin of the Eucharist, whether that's in Paul in 1 Corinthians or Mark, for Paul, it's a memory of the night before Jesus suffered, and for Mark, it's the story of the Last Supper. But both of those are looking back to Passover events, which of course is an annual event. So you have actual praxis as a weekly event, but a memory of an annual event. Now what's happened there is that the praxis is the continuity, but praxis wants a defining moment as its origin and goes back to the Eucharist event. So the continuity that Christians actually have is the continuity of repetition. The memory is actually an idealization of the origins of that practice, and they put it in this, this last, the psychologically defining moment, the Passover he ate just before he suffered with his closest disciples. And that element of past, for instance, is not yet even found in the account for Mark. It's the final meal in Jerusalem. He's eaten many meals, and this is the final and greatest meal. It's Luke that adds that element of finality. It's not just the supper in Jerusalem, but it's the Last Supper. Now let's look at what the elements are. As we go through, the Eucharist is actually the continuity not of one meal, but of all the different meals that Jesus ate. It's at meals that he models his own community. The new people are the people who are, of course, the outcasts. sinners, tax collectors, they're welcome. There are women present. There are even women who anoint his feet at a meal. And all of these are saying the Eucharist, the boundaries of this new organization, this new Israel, are going to be defined by an inner purity, not an external purity, and it is the welcome to the table. So, for instance, we actually have meal practice stories. Why does your master eat with sinners and tax collectors? Because, and you're supposed, the ideal here is we'll say, because of course all these are reconciled. And then we have stories of reconciliation, most famously the story of the prodigal son, where the prodigal son is welcomed back and is brought into the feast. So the meal practice of Christians is a living continuity with all of the meals of Jesus. And then that leads us to the question, well then, what are the most common elements? Ancient meals, ancient Greco-Roman meals, so the sort of meals of the people who would have heard the gospel, are highly stratified affairs. You invite those who are your clients, who are automatically lower than you, and you show that you are the big person by providing for them. And in fact, there's actually stories where Jesus says, take the lower place and let everyone show you. But the Christian meal is to be radically different in that it stresses it's open. Even slaves eat with masters. So, what's the greatest miracle of early Christianity? The greatest miracle was here was a view of God and the universe where a slave would eat with his master and a master would have to share. And of course that's why Paul has to give out to the Corinthians, hey, if you're going to eat the Christian meal, you've got to realize that this breaks all the social boundaries. There's no insiders, outsiders. All are one in Christ. And he says, well, why are they all one? Because they all share one loaf, they all share one cup. So what are the characteristics of this meal? Well, the table becomes the symbol of welcome. And it's the ordinary table. It'll not be into the early 2nd century that people will say, what do you Christians do for an altar in your religion? And the answer comes back, well, yes, we do have an altar. We don't have a temple. We use a table as an altar. Amazingly, today, Christians will refer to where they have the Eucharist often as an altar, forgetting that they're missing the point. It's a table, and for Christians, an ordinary dining table can fulfill the needs that in another religion, such as a pagan religion, would be fulfilled on an altar. So the key elements are that there was one table, and it's a table which around this table is modelled the new community, and at that table are the outsiders, and being at that table is itself an act of being reconciled. And then at that table, the act of Eucharist is action, it's thanking the Father, and there that group in Christ thank the Father, and they thank the Father using the characteristic elements of Thanksgiving sacrifices in the 1st century. The Thanksgiving sacrifice always takes place with prayer and a meal. So the meal, which actually bonds them together as a community and bonds them together to the memory and to the person of Jesus, becomes also their thanksgiving and sacrificial meal. And so within the meal, there's a focus on a single loaf, of which they all have a share, and then Paul gives that a significance. And then there's something which is very unusual because it's unique in the ancient world, it's unique to the followers of Jesus, and that is that they share a cup. So they express themselves one as a people through the intimacy of sharing a cup and sharing a loaf. They express being the new people and being reconciled by being round one table. They do it every week, and doing it every week, they they understand themselves to be not just having a meal in memory of Jesus, but Jesus is present among them. And then it's not to meet Jesus. They meet, every time they gather, Jesus is present. But when they meet at the meal, Jesus is present, and then they, in Jesus, offer thanks to the Father. Now so you see that looking back to the origins, modern Christians think it's easy. It's actually very complex because the evidence is very complex, and it actually reveals a very different understanding of the Eucharist and a completely different set of emphases than most modern Christians would recognise.
Thank you very much. So there we are, the early Eucharist as a meal, as a proper meal.
As a proper meal, and a focus on not on meeting Jesus, but being with Jesus, thanking the Father.
Thank you, Tom.